Hey there. Today we're diving deep on something I think a lot of us can relate to. Navigating single life while kind of keeping an eye on marriage, especially from a faith perspective. You've shared some really interesting articles and notes on this. I'm super curious to see what we can uncover together.
Yeah, it's a topic that brings up a lot of different emotions for people,
Yeah.
from excitement to anxiety. So diving into these specific sources you've picked, I think will be really valuable.
Yeah, for sure. And one thing that really jumped out at me from your notes was this fear that so many people have. Like, will my relationships just end up like my parents or siblings? It's like, are we destined to just repeat these patterns? Have you ever felt that way?
Oh yeah, definitely. It's a really common concern. But one of the sources you sent, The Sacred Search by Gary Thomas, he reminds us that God doesn't just have some generic plan for relationships. He has a unique, specific plan for you. He even uses the word hope when talking about our future in Jeremiah 29.11:1.
Hmm. Okay, so it's not just about dodging bad relationship patterns. It's more about believing that God has something good in store that's actually specific to us.
Exactly. And The Sacred Search goes on to say that this applies way beyond romance.
Mm.
It's about trusting God's unique design for our whole lives. That's pretty liberating.
It really is. And it makes me think about, all those must-have lists we create for a future spouse. Mine's probably more like a wish list to Santa. But another source you sent, Choosing God's Best by Dr. Neil Clark Warren, it really challenges that whole checklist mentality. What did
Uh-huh.
you think about that?
Yeah, it's interesting. Warren doesn't say checklists are bad,
Mm.
but he really encourages us to compare those lists to God's criteria.
Right. Yeah.
He actually uses 1 Samuel 16.7 as an example, where God tells Samuel, don't be swayed by outward appearances when choosing a king, because God sees the heart.
So it's less about finding someone who checks all of our boxes and more about aligning our desires with what God actually values in a person.
Yeah. It's not about settling. It's more about trusting that God might see potential and compatibility where we don't. After all, he is the ultimate matchmaker.
Okay, that's a powerful way to think about it. But I do have a question. Choosing God's best also talks about healing before uniting, which I found really thought-provoking. Can you kind of elaborate on what that means?
Absolutely. Warren emphasizes that we all carry baggage into relationships, whether it's from past romances, family dynamics, or even just our own insecurities. He argues that ignoring this baggage is like building a house on a shaky foundation.
And I think that's where your personal notes come in, right? You actually highlighted some specific areas you want to work on before entering a relationship.
Yeah, I was really struck by Warren's suggestion to actually use this time to identify and surrender those personal wounds to God. It's about allowing God to do that deep inner healing so we can love from a place of wholeness and not brokenness.
I love that. It reminds me of that beautiful passage in 1 Corinthians 13 about love being patient and kind, not envious or boastful. It's that kind of love we all want, right? But it sounds like it requires some serious inner work first.
It does. And one of your highlighted passages in Choosing God's Best talked about how identifying your personal relationship patterns is a great place to start that inner work.
That's so helpful. So we've talked about, facing those what if fears,
Mhm.
aligning our desires with God's, and doing some inner healing before even thinking about uniting. What else did you find helpful in these sources?
Well, both The Sacred Search and Choosing God's Best get surprisingly practical about how to actually behave while waiting for marriage. They even provide some specific advice, which I know you're going to love.
Oh, lay it on me. Give me all the practical wisdom.
Okay, so The Sacred Search encourages us to really use this time to get to know ourselves. Thomas suggests asking yourself some tough questions, like, what are my deepest desires? What brings me joy? What are my non-negotiables in a relationship? He says these answers can really help clarify what you're looking for in a future spouse.
I love that. It's like doing some serious soul searching before venturing out into the dating world.
Exactly. And then Choosing God's Best gets even more specific about setting boundaries in the meantime.
Okay, so we're talking like the how to behave guide.
Exactly. Think late night visits, excessive physical touch, spending all your time with one person when you're not actually in a relationship, things like that.
So basically avoiding situations that could lead to temptation or send mixed signals. It's about being intentional with our actions.
Yes. Warren connects this to 1 Thessalonians 5.22, where it says to abstain from all appearance of evil. It's about acting in a way that honors God and our future spouse, even when no one's watching.
That's a great point. It's not just about avoiding getting caught. It's about living with integrity and respecting the kind of relationship we want to have someday.
Exactly. And it goes beyond just the romantic aspect. It's about building trust with ourselves and with God.
Okay, This is all making so much sense. But I have to admit, the waiting part can be tough. How do these sources address that?
That's a great question. And it leads us to the most encouraging part of our deep dive.
Yeah.
Both sources really emphasize that singleness isn't just some holding pattern. It's a time of incredible potential.
Yes. I love that. So instead of waiting, it's about preparing. And not just for marriage, but for life in general, right?
Absolutely. And this is where I think your sources really shine. They offer some very specific ways to use this time to your advantage. For example, the Sacred Search focuses on
Yeah.
using this time to develop your character and deepen your relationship with God. Thomas calls it becoming the kind of person who attracts the kind of person you want to be with.
Okay, so it's about working on ourselves first, becoming the best version of ourselves before even thinking about finding someone else.
Exactly. And choosing God's best takes a slightly different angle. Warren encourages us to see this time as an opportunity to build a strong foundation for the future.
What do you mean by foundation?
Think practical skills. He suggests focusing on things like financial responsibility, communication skills, conflict resolution, even cooking. He argues that mastering these areas now will not only make you a more well-rounded person, but also a better partner in the long run.
Wow, I never thought about it that way. So it's like we're getting a head start on all those marriage prep classes before we even meet the person.
Exactly. And both sources emphasize the importance of serving others during this time. They argue that focusing on others' needs can actually shift our perspective and help us avoid becoming self-absorbed in our own singleness.
That's a great point. It's like taking the focus off of what we don't have and putting it on what we can give.
Right. And speaking of giving, both Thomas and Warren suggest using this time to discover and pursue your passions. What lights you up? What are you naturally drawn to? They argue that these passions are often clues to our God-given purpose, and exploring them can bring immense joy and fulfillment regardless of our relationship status.
I love that. It's like we're being encouraged to create a life we love now instead of waiting for someone else to make us happy.
Exactly. And you know what else is amazing? All this preparation, all this growth, it doesn't just benefit our future relationships, it benefits us right now.
Hmm.
We're becoming more confident, more fulfilled, more whole individuals. And that's a pretty awesome side effect.
Absolutely. But let's be real. Even with all this amazing advice, waiting can still be hard. I know I've had moments of feeling impatient, discouraged, even a little envious of my friends who are getting married. Have you ever felt that way?
Of course, we all have those moments. And that's where the reminder that God's timing is perfect becomes so crucial.
Mm-hmm.
Both sources emphasize that trusting God's plan, even when we don't understand it, is key to navigating this season with peace and hope.
I feel like I need that on a t-shirt. God's timing is perfect. But honestly, sometimes it's easier said than done. What helps you when those doubts creep in?
Well, I'm reminded of that verse in Proverbs 18:22 that says, "He who finds a wife finds a good thing and obtains favor from the Lord." It's a reminder that a godly spouse is a blessing from God. And he knows the perfect time for that blessing to unfold in our lives.
That's so encouraging. It's not just about finding anyone. It's about finding the right person at the right time.
Exactly. And when I start to get impatient, I try to shift my focus from when to how. How can I use this time to become the kind of person who is ready for that blessing? How can I grow in my faith, my character, my skills? It's about taking an active role in my own preparation instead of passively waiting on the sidelines.
I love that. So it's like we're not just sitting around twiddling our thumbs. We're actively becoming the person we want to be,
Right.
which in turn makes us more attractive to the kind of person we want to attract.
Right. And that leads us to one of my favorite concepts from these sources, this idea of living like the answer is on its way. It's about aligning our actions with our faith, acting as if God's promise is already in motion.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What does that look like in practice?
What could be something as simple as setting aside time each day to pray for your future spouse, even though you haven't met them yet. Or it could be making a conscious effort to develop those character qualities you want to see in a partner. It's about taking those practical steps, big or small, that demonstrate our trust in God's plan and our willingness to prepare for it.
That's so powerful. It's not about wishful thinking. It's about taking tangible action that reflects our belief that God is working behind the scenes.
Yes, and it goes beyond just relationships. It's about approaching all areas of our lives with that same confident expectation. It's like we're saying, God, I trust you. I believe your promises are true, and I'm going to live my life as if they've already come to pass.
That's a beautiful way to live. And it reminds me of that verse in 2 Corinthians 5:7 that says, we walk by faith, not by sight. It's about choosing to believe even when we don't have all the answers, even when we don't see the tangible evidence yet.
Exactly. And that kind of faith, that unwavering trust in God's goodness and faithfulness, is what will ultimately sustain us through the waiting, through the uncertainty, and lead us into the fullness of His plan for our lives.
Okay, I am feeling so inspired right now. But before we wrap up, I want to circle back to something you said earlier about identifying our relationship patterns. I think that's something a lot of us could benefit from exploring further.
It's so important. And one of the things Choosing God's Best talks about is how our past experiences, both positive and negative, can shape our expectations and even our subconscious desires in relationships.
So it's not just about knowing what we want, it's about understanding why we want it.
Exactly. And Warren suggests asking ourselves some tough questions like, what patterns have I noticed in my past relationships? What attracted me to those people? What were the deal breakers? What lessons did I learn?
Those are some great questions. I'm already starting to think about my own answers. But how do we actually use that information to make better choices in the future?
Well, Warren encourages us to look for patterns that might be unhealthy or even destructive. For example, if you consistently find yourself attracted to emotionally unavailable partners, that's a red flag.
Yeah, it's like our subconscious is trying to recreate familiar dynamics, even if they weren't good for us.
Exactly. And once we identify those patterns, we can start to break free from them. Warren suggests seeking professional counseling if needed, or even talking to trusted friends or mentors who can offer objective insights.
That's so helpful. It's like we're taking inventory of our emotional baggage and figuring out how to unpack it in a healthy way.
Right. And remember, this isn't about blaming ourselves or our past. It's about taking ownership of our patterns and choosing to create healthier, more fulfilling relationships in the future.
I love that. It's about empowerment, about taking control of our own happiness and choosing to break free from cycles that no longer serve us.
Exactly. And it all comes back to that core message of trusting God's plan and using this time of singleness to become the best version of ourselves.
So, as we wrap up this amazing deep dive, what's one final thought you'd like to leave our listener with?
I'd encourage you to embrace this season of singleness, not as a waiting room, but as a training ground. It's a time for incredible personal growth, a time to deepen your relationship with God, a time to discover your passions, and a time to prepare your heart for the amazing plan that God has in store for you. Trust His timing, lean into His grace, and watch as He unfolds His beautiful plan for your life one step at a time.
That is such a great reminder. And as you're doing that inner work, becoming the best version of yourself, I hope you feel empowered by that thought of that good thing Gary Thomas talks about, that God's favor is upon you as you seek a godly spouse.
Yeah, that promise is something to hold on to. But it's also important to remember that even in a God-ordained relationship, you're still going to face challenges. It's not about finding someone who completes you or magically solves all your problems.
Right. And it makes me think about how choosing God's best emphasizes the importance of shared faith. Dr. Warren really believes that having a partner who's equally committed to growing in their relationship with God is key to navigating those inevitable bumps in the road.
Absolutely. And that's why this whole idea of preparation is so crucial. It's not just about finding the right person. It's about becoming the right person ourselves so we can build a strong, healthy, faith-centered relationship.
I love that. So it's like we're both bringing our A game to the table, not expecting the other person to fill in our gaps or fix our issues.
Right. And you know what else is interesting? Both sources talk about the importance of not putting our lives on hold while we wait for marriage. They encourage us to pursue our passions, develop our skills, and live full, meaningful lives right now, regardless of our relationship status.
That's such a great point. It's like we're not just waiting for the one, we're living out our purpose right now, which in turn makes us more attractive to the kind of person who's also living out their purpose.
Exactly. It's about becoming the best version of ourselves.
Right.
Not for someone else, but for ourselves and for God. And in doing so, we become magnetic to the right people, to the people who are on a similar journey of growth and faith.
So to wrap this all up, it sounds like the key takeaway here is that singleness is not a waiting room. It's a training ground. It's a time to invest in ourselves, to grow in our faith, to pursue our passions, and to prepare our hearts for the amazing plan that God has for us, both now and in the future.
You nailed it. And no matter where you are in your journey, whether you're feeling impatient, discouraged, hopeful, or maybe a bit of everything, remember that you're not alone. God sees you, He loves you, and they did. He has an amazing plan for your life, including your future relationships. Trust His timing, lean into His grace, and keep your eyes fixed on Him. He will never disappoint you.
Beautifully said. Thanks for diving deep with us today. And listener, I hope this deep dive has left you feeling encouraged, empowered, and maybe even a little excited about this season of singleness. Remember, it's not just about waiting, it's about becoming. Until next time, keep learning, keep growing, and keep the faith